here today to discuss two separate dockets. Docket 0211, a petition for a special law and act relative to voting precincts in the city of Boston that was sponsored by Mayor Martin J. Walsh, and also docket 0314, an ordinance requiring review of precincts in the city of Boston that was sponsored by my colleague, City Council President Andrea Campbell, who's seated to my right, and my colleague, City Council Michelle Wu, who is seated to my left. Docket 0211 is a home rule petition that will allow for the city to establish sub-precincts in order to alleviate crowds and lines in some parts of the city that have experienced significant growth. None of these adjustments will change any ward boundary lines, and they will not change representation for the purposes of congressional, representative, senatorial, and council districts. This home rule petition is necessary so that a few new sub-precincts and polling locations may be included in the Commonwealth statewide voter registration information system, also known as VRIS. Docket 0211 was assigned to the committee back on January 30th of 2019. Docket 0314 is a proposed ordinance which seeks to amend Chapter 2 of the City Code by adding the appropriate committee of the City Council that conducts a review of city precincts every 5 years. The report shall include information about population shifts, development in neighborhoods, and impact of precinct size on polling locations, staffing, and election day operations, and other factors necessary. Docket 0314 was assigned to the committee back on February 6th of 2019. It should be noted this hearing is being streamlined on Boston City Council TV. Online is being recorded and will be broadcast at a later date on Comcast Channel 8, RCN Channel 82, and Verizon 1964. So I know that we've been joined by the administration panel. We know that we have Dion Irish, Commissioner of the Election Department, also joined by our I always get the title mixed up because you're sort of I've always have you as the utility infielder, but what's the appropriate title? So assistant registrar. Piemonte is here. We also are joined by former president of the Boston City Council and attorney Larry DeCara, and also filling in Ian is here on behalf of the Mass Vote and standing in on behalf of Cheryl Crawford. So I appreciate your time and attention. We're going to get, I guess, right into it. I know my colleagues will have some questions as well, so I'll defer to Dion as the commissioner between you guys, and then we'll go from there.
Well, thank you. Good afternoon, Chairman Flaherty, President Campbell, and all the other members of this esteemed body. Thank you for the opportunity to be here today to talk about what we think is a very important thing, and it's directly related to voter access, our precincts. As you know, a precinct is the smallest boundary, electoral boundary, and it's the building block for district making. From a voter standpoint, it also impacts where a voter goes to vote. It impacts the voter wait time, polling place staffing, and many other things. And over the years, the city has grown tremendously in population, and some parts of the city more so than other parts. So currently we have a huge disparity where we have precincts that may have 5,000 voters and precincts that may have 500. As you can imagine, that is a very concerning thing for us. In order for us to properly conduct elections, we need to have precincts that are manageable in size. And there are ways for us to do this comprehensively, and we'll talk about that as well today. But what we want to talk about first is some immediate steps that we need to take to address our most urgent parts of the city so that we can properly allow voting in 2019 and also in the 2020 elections. So we have a presentation that we've prepared for you that will go through that, and we'd love to answer any questions, address any concerns that may arise. And also just want to note for the public that this presentation is also on our website, so they could view it as well. Okay. So I'm going to ask Mr. Piemonte to just walk us through the PowerPoint slides.
Very good. Thank you, Sabino. Welcome again. And actually, you know what? Just before we go, we've also been joined by my colleagues in order of their arrival. City Councilor Red Flynn, City Councilor Josh Sakin, and City Councilor Kim Janey are also joining us as well. But you have the floor, Sabino.
That's this thing where. So let's start off with the precincts that we're going to be showing some voter counts and resident counts. The first precinct in question is Ward 3, Precinct 6, and that's, well, most of the precincts that are involved here are in the financial district here, and that's what comprises the precinct right now. And in that total precinct, there's 4,536 voters in that district, or in that precinct, excuse me. And this is what our proposal is, to come up with two separate sub-precincts.
Sabino, just for our ratification, just maybe also identify the actual polling location, so that's the City Hall polling location?
That is correct. This is a City Hall location.
Okay.
We envision having both places in the same place to avoid any kind of confusion from any of the voters. What it will do is have a separate machine for the proposal that we're putting. So there'll be two machines that people will be able to vote at, obviously respective to where they're assigned to. So our proposal for 3-6 will be 2,156 voters, and 3-6A will be 2,380 voters. As you can see, we try to do everything we can to divide it equally as best we possibly could. So the next precinct that's in question is 3-7. 3-7 votes right now at the Cathedral High School, and at this moment, that's what 3-7 looks like, and the total voters there is 3,787. Our proposal is to create two sub-precincts there with the new numbers, and representing 3-7 is 1962, and 3-7A will be 1,825.
Both voting again at the Cathedral?
Yep, they will both vote at the same location. Okay. The next precinct is Ward 3, Precinct 8. Just to make reference, this is the largest precinct in the city at this moment. There is 6,138 registered voters there. Our proposal for Ward 3, Precinct 8 is to split it up into three sections. They will all vote at the YMCA in Chinatown. The facility will house three separate precincts there to accommodate Ward 3, Precinct 8. So the new counts will be Ward 3, Precinct 8 is 1646. 3-8A will be 2448. And Ward 3-8B will be 2044, so 2044. Sure. Ward 3, Precinct 8 is 1,646. Ward 3, Precinct 8A will be 2,448. Ward 3, Precinct 8B will be 2,044. The reason for us leaving 3-8 a little bit shyer than the other ones is there's a huge construction right now that's going on Harrison Ave and Berkeley Street, which will comprise many, many units that will bring that total up to pretty much par with the other two.
So Sabino, so you would be basically putting, say for example, at the YMCA Chinatown, you'd be putting in three different machines that you feed the ballot into, and then you'd put up some additional, those little triangular kiosks where you get to fill out the ballot.
That's correct.
So right now at YMCA Chinatown for 3-8, there's one machine that you feed into. You got a couple different kiosks, and then everyone's backed up and
Correct.
waiting in line for that. So, okay.
So it'll
Same
be-
with the other precincts.
And it'll be three check-ins now, so.
Three separate
Right now,
check-ins.
there's one check-in. We try to do the best we can to split the books and have
Okay.
multiple check-ins, but that's a little bit difficult with the way that we split the book. But in this proposal, it'll be sectioned off by area, so each one will have its own polling location book, as well as its own machine to do the checkout.
So we're gonna need 5 extra poll checkers is what you're telling us.
Oh, and this location will need 12 extra at minimum, because it's three separate precincts.
Got it. Okay,
And because of this precinct, a lot of translations as well.
got it, okay.
Okay, so continuing on, the next precinct is Ward 5, Precinct 1. They vote at the Franklin Institute. Our proposal, our registered voter count there is 4,360. Our proposal for this is to split that up into two, which is 5-1 and 5-1A. 5-1 will comprise 2,097 registered voters, and 5-1A will have 2,263 registered voters.
Franklin Institute, if not mistaken, did that just sell,
I believe it,
Put out for sale. It has
was put out for sale?
on the market.
So at some point, does that no longer become a viable polling location? Are we on top of that as
Yes.
that
it all-
building is?
It all depends on what they make that building into. If another institution purchases it, we will try to stay for consistencies. But if we need to move it, that is on our agenda to keep an eye out for.
Yeah, my sense of just based on that location, it's probably a private sale and it'll be private development. I just don't, I think you may want to start looking sooner rather than later to try to find an appropriate polling location for 5-1, but leave it up to you and the district council to kind of, council plan any updates on that site?
Yes, Mr. Chair, it's, I read recent reports about Ben Franklin being up for sale. One thing that would be a concern of mine is they actually vote on 2 locations, entrances, one on the Castle Square side, and then on the other side of the building. On the other side of the building, there's a handicap ramp as well. So I would be concerned if that were to move because of how close it is to Castle Square with a lot of elderly and disabled residents at Castle Square. I would want to make sure that they are thoroughly educated on exactly where the new location would be and to make sure all issues relating to handicapped access are also addressed. I spend a lot of time over there, and I can tell you there's a lot of seniors, a lot of immigrants, a lot of disabled, so that's a big concern of mine.
Okay.
Very good. Thank you, Council Flynn. Continue, Sabino.
Okay, so the next precinct that we have that's up is Ward 6, Precinct 1, which is the one of the largest growing precincts in the city. Right now, there's 5,817 registered voters there. It comprises, obviously, the Seaport and comes all the way over to West Broadway. And our proposal is to split this.
They're at the Condon School, correct?
Okay, I'm sorry, it votes at the Condon School. Right now, there's 3 precincts at the Condon School. This will be an addition to that, a 4th. But we are also proposing a potential polling location for 61A, which we have preliminary agreements with District Hall to have that precinct vote at District Hall. 61A will come up with 2,054 registered voters. And right now, 61 is slated to have 3,763 registered voters. Again, 61A is constantly growing, and there is some substantial development there that is going on right now, and I'm sure that's going to continue to grow as well, so.
So 61A would be District Hall?
That's correct. And there is a tentative agreement with District Hall for us to vote there in the upcoming elections.
And Sabino, that's also, I think, potentially a temporary location, right? District Hall is slated, I think, at some point for redevelopment and/or.
I believe
a
that is
different use.
correct. We'll take that year by year until we find a more suitable location that's become more permanent.
Gotcha. Chair recognizes Council Flynn.
Thank you, Council Flaherty. At District Hall, what is the access for the disabled?
I don't know the exact layouts of how that's going to work, but if I'm,
Yeah, so we've done an initial assessment, and it is ADA compliant, so it would be accessible.
Okay, I've been there many times. I'd like to do a tour of it just to make sure that I'm comfortable with it, where, there's a lot of ongoing construction there as well, but I want to make sure it's 100% in compliance with ADA.
Okay. So, no, we'd be happy to
Okay.
do a tour with you.
okay. So continuing on, the next precinct is Ward 9, Precinct 3. Which precinct is that? I forget what they vote. Is that something? Correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe it's the Hampton House is where they vote. Yes. And this one here is slated to be split into 2 precincts, voting at the same location. actually, no, excuse me.
Mandela.
One will be moving to the Mandela to make it a little bit more accessible for the voters there, and 9-3 will remain at the Hampton House. The registered voter count originally was 3,159, and the new proposed numbers for 9-3 will be 1,509, and for 9-3A will be 1,650.
Chair recognizes Counsel Janey.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. What is the plan then to, I appreciate the effort to make things more convenient, particularly for those who reside in Mandela or near Mandela to vote at Mandela, but how do you then communicate that in time for voters to have the necessary information so that they're not going to their old polling location, getting turned away, possibly not voting again because they've been turned away? So what is the plan to make sure, not just for 9-3, but the Seaport District and Councilor Flynn's district, that if we're changing polling locations, what's the plan to inform voters, or residents, I should say?
So it would be the same plan that we utilize. Anytime there's a changing polling place, it does require a lot of education. So
help me understand what that
So
is.
we do a direct mailing to voters. In addition to that, we also do advertisement in local newspapers. And we also work with, depends on the context, with community organizations that may be in that area. So we use as many channels of communication as we can find to educate voters. But that includes, like I said, starts off with a first-class mail.
And so everyone on your voter list who lives in 9-3 will get the information, or just the residents who are being asked to move? Just the residents that are
Just the residents who are being asked to move. And
Right.
we also do signage at the locations as well. So we'll use every avenue we can to educate voters.
And when you talk about the local papers, which papers would you, so this is, Northampton Street, here's the map right here. All of so Roxy Holmes is in here. How will you, which papers will you do ads in?
The papers, we determine that, we develop a strategy based on what area of the city, what we think may be a good channel of communication. It may even be that we need to flyer, do lit drops in buildings. So we're flexible with the strategy, and we're very cognizant that it is very difficult to get people to understand when there is a change. So we would happy to come up with a detailed outreach plan and share that with you.
I would appreciate that. Thank you so much, Commissioner. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Anything else, Sabino?
No, those are the 6 precincts that we are proposing for sub-precinct at this time.
Yeah, so I just want to add to that. The reason why we're approaching this through a home rule petition is because we already have existing districts on the state legislative level, on the congressional level, city council level, that have been in place, that were put in place after the 2010 census. So in order for us to utilize the authority that the Board of Election Commissioners has, which, let me jump back to that for a second. The Board of Election Commissioners in Boston has the authority to actually make these divisions based on Acts of 1921, Chapter 220. It gives the Board of Election Commissioners the sole authority and discretion to make changes to precincts. However, to utilize that type of authority at this time and to get these buy-in from the state and to be able to put these changes into the voter registration and information system, we will need buy-in on the local level as well as on the state level. And so a home rule petition process is the best way for us to approach this, to make these changes and get everyone on the same page and implement sub-precincts.
So does it make sense to do it before the census information or after the census information?
This makes sense to do this now because this is very urgent and should, we're trying to actually get this done in 2017. So we'd love to get it done now, but the other conversation that we're going to have regarding the other docket is about what can we do after 2020 census so that we could, on a comprehensive basis, equalize the precincts in the city of Boston.
So Larry, we're going to turn it over to you, obviously as a panel member, and you got experience around this stuff, so if you can share your thoughts, state your
Great.
name and
Thank
affiliation
you.
for the record.
Thank you very much, Mr. President, and it's rare that four people who've been city council presidents are looking each other straight in the eye, so it reminds me of that. I think it was when Kennedy had the Nobel laureates in the White House, he said, there hasn't been so much talent in this room since Thomas Jefferson ate alone. So I'm honored to be here, both because I served on this body and also because I have some experience in the matters before you, and I'm very supportive of the efforts to streamline voting in the city and the good work which the Commissioner and Mr. Piemonte do. I think it's very important to take these first steps. I began studying wards and precinct maps in the 1960s. A friend of mine suggested I went from collecting baseball cards to studying precinct maps. Probably true. I did a major study of the 1967 city election when I was an undergraduate at Harvard. The ward lines were last redrawn in the mid-1920s. That's even before I was here. I can take neither credit nor blame. They've been in place for a long time. The precinct lines were changed in either 70 or 71. And once again, I wasn't in the room, but I had to deal with it because I ran the first time in 71. As all of us know, we have a federal census every 10th year. One soon will be underway. Let's hope that the current administration in Washington doesn't undermine its importance. Precinct lines must be in place so that state representatives, state senatorial, and congressional districts can be drawn in the spring and summer of 2021. And they must be in place no later than 1 year before the election in 2022, because state representatives must be resident in the district from which they would be elected. And there was a case after the 2000 redistricting where a representative from the Cape actually physically moved so she could be in a different district than the one she lived in after redistricting. So that moves quite quickly. And all of this must be done in accordance with the one-person, one-vote decisions, going back now many decades, beginning with Baker and Carr and Reynolds and Sims and Mahan and Howell, and it's enough lawyers, and we've all studied those cases. Interestingly, from the point of view of the city, after many years of seeing a diminished number of state representatives from Boston, this cycle will probably see the district numbers stay the same, and some of the Boston districts may shed precincts in order to pass muster for the very reasons we're discussing, because of the surge of population in the downtown area and the areas around it. And city council districts will be impacted by population changes. I expect the districts to the north, you know who you are, will shed precincts, and districts to the south will gain precincts. And I have never met an elected official who wanted to see his or her district changed in any way. But it is inevitable there will be some changes, both to state representative districts in Boston, to a lesser extent senatorial districts, and certainly the council districts in advance of the 2023 elections. There are significant limitations as to the variations that can be held among districts. And there's a greater variation permitted for a state representative district. They let you go about 5% on either side of the median, and a much smaller variation for congressional districts. And I've worked on these things for about 35 years and be happy to discuss any of the specifics. Boston has been exempt from the rules which apply to the rest of the state, I believe, since the 20s, as far back as I can remember. I would hope they would continue to be exempt, because it would be illogical to have Boston be forced to have every precinct contain the same number of people, as is the case in the rest of the state, primarily because the voting patterns in different parts of the city vary so greatly. Now, at least 3 of us have run citywide, and we know that if you take a look at, for example, Ward 20 precincts, 10, 11, 12, 13, and 14, the core of West Roxbury, mostly single-family homes, where most everybody is an adult, most everybody is a citizen, and people tend to participate, high number of city employees, great stability in those neighborhoods. You have turnouts sometimes which are in the 80% range in those precincts. But, on the other hand, take a look at Ward 21, Precinct 2, and 3 and 4 are not far behind. They have very, very low turnouts except in presidential years. In fact, sometimes those turnouts are more 8% than 80%. And I was telling the commissioner that I was on the ballot once in September of '73, and 6 people voted in Ward 21, Precinct 2. So had a precinct worker there all day long. He was a BU student. Wasn't too hard for him to do. He got a sunburn. He was out there so much. And he told me I came in second. 6 people voted. The socialists got 4, and I got 3. So when you have precincts like that, and there are many in the city, where there's high numbers of transients and students and people who move frequently, it's inevitable, and the same patterns are in place in the rest of the country, that fewer people will vote. That's why these good people to my right need flexibility rather than rigidity. They shouldn't be forced to abide by the same sets of rules as the rest of the state. And remembering, we count people including children, people including folks who are here legally. It's not only citizens, not only voters, and those numbers vary dramatically. There are precincts I expect in East Boston where in excess of half the people who live in the precinct are ineligible to vote because they're children or because they're not citizens. Whether they choose to vote is a whole other issue whatsoever. So I would argue that it makes absolutely no sense if there's a uniformity imposed upon us as is imposed upon the rest of the state, because a precinct, for example, 2010 or whatever, has a much higher number of people voting on a constant level, whereas in some other districts it varies significantly. Now, I think, and the Commissioner and I have talked about this, that there could be an effort to consolidate the number of precincts, probably down to about 200, save the city hundreds of thousands of dollars each election cycle, by decreasing the number of precincts in the lower voting areas and by creating precincts in some of these areas which have such increases in
So Larry,
population.
we have like 250, 255 right now, 254, 255. So we would go down and say 200.
I'm just saying there's a round number.
Hypothetically, so then the other precincts would absorb the sort of the 55?
Correct.
Based on all trends, whether it's a municipal election or it's a statewide?
Correct,
Or it's
but I would argue that you would want to have a weighted formula so that if hypothetically 21-2, you could probably have 4,000 people living in 21-2 knowing that not a lot of people vote, whereas you wouldn't want to have more than, 2,000 or 3,000 people living in higher voting precincts.
And
This
through
is
the
a-
chair, is that something that the election department is looking at in terms of just being able to shrink the overall number of precincts, which I think is a great idea as a
I mean,
citywide.
there is a potential for consolidation and a reduction, but it's a collective decision that we'd have to make. There's pros and cons, and we'd like a process where we're getting input from everyone before we make a final decision. Getting down to 200 could mean longer wait for some voters who currently don't have a long wait. So there's pros and cons, and that's something that I think we would have to have a very transparent and in-depth conversation about.
But from a functionality standpoint, and obviously we always struggle to find good quality locations that are T accessible, that are handicap accessible, that proper lighting, et cetera. This probably helps us streamline that as well. I would think from a management perspective, it's easier to handle 200 precincts than 255.
Yeah, it would be, but I think ideally what we want to have is we want to have the right number. We don't need to have any more precincts than we need because it's a waste of resources, but we also don't want to have so few that they're bursting at the seams, or we have longer wait times or difficulty, properly conducting elections.
Continue, Larry.
So obviously, as we discussed earlier today, the precincts which were referenced have ballooned, and I think the remedy, the temporary remedy, makes a lot of sense. But there's a lot of historical aberrations. In '70, when the precinct lines were last drawn, we had 2 precinct lines in Dorchester 13 and 15 of Ward 17, which were combined for 17-4, which I think you have 17-4, Madam President. That's a big precinct. My first election, I got 932 votes in that precinct. That's an enormous precinct. Yet right next door to it is 1711, which is a teeny precinct and has been for years. And I've been in JP now about 30 years. 19-9 is a tiny precinct. Maybe 800 or 900 people live there. Not exactly sure why. And 19-8, where I lived for a few years, isn't much bigger. Those are tiny precincts. And then looking throughout the city, you've had neighborhoods which were non-residential have become residential, and other neighborhoods, I think specifically of Ward 8, the outer precincts 4, 5, and 6, which were residential at one point, are now more industrial and commercial. So there can be some work done to improve all of those things. I would caution, however, because sometimes this discussion arises, against redrawing the ward lines, because but for the election of ward committees for the state parties, and I'm not even sure if the Republicans have committees these days, but I know Democrats do, those ward lines do not serve an important purpose electorally, because we've used precinct lines going back to 1974 for all of the state districts, and we've used them as well for the council districts going back to 83. Ward lines are important in terms of ISD, in terms of other record keeping, assessing, very, very important. And I think it'd be a mistake to try to change those, as funny as some of those lines are. And once again, all the people who drew those lines are dead, so we can talk about them. But when it was done, it was almost even. And I think also we have more flexibility because we have the ability to put more people in a smaller area. We don't have those big clunker machines like we used to have back in the 70s and 80s, which limited the amount of people who could vote. So I certainly support this short-term solution. And also want to point out we've had dramatic changes in voting patterns in the city. We've had poor turnouts in the so-called off-year elections, which I don't like that phrase because it's not an off-year if you're running, but that's what the papers will call it. I think the last time the number was just over 50,000 people.
Yeah.
Didn't hit 51.
Didn't.
And maybe a little more this year, but I don't expect it to be 70 or 75. And on the other hand, presidential turnouts have continued to increase. The two Obama elections were 234 and 255. The last election was 277. And that's, major changes, because those numbers were closer to 200 a generation ago. And if the 2018 election is any barometer, the current incumbent in the White House has awoken some sleeping giants. And I expect that the presidential election in 2020 could hit 300,000. I think that's very, very likely, given the increase in population and that's a good reason to fix up these sub-precincts right now. The delta between those who vote in the presidential election and those who vote in other elections has been in the 100,000 range. But for this last November election, where once again, I think as a result of the climate in Washington, we had 200,000 people vote. That's the highest number, and correct me if I'm wrong, gentlemen, I think it's the highest number in a non-presidential year since the 83 mayoral election, when we also hit 200, 201, 202. So we have over 100,000 people in Boston. I would argue most of them young, educated, and not from here, who only vote once every 4 years. And we have to make provisions for them so those lines are not long in those quadrennial elections. And if you take a look at it, with all due respect to all of us, notwithstanding the fact that 6 years ago now, we had the first truly open mayoral seat in 30 years. 30 years is a long time, since '83, the election of giants. We only had 140,000 people vote. And I think that's indicative of the demographics of the city changing. People read the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal. They read it online. They don't read the Globe. I may be the only person in JP who gets the Herald delivered every morning. Very different demographics. People do not know their councils. They don't know their state reps. Whether that's right or wrong, that's reality. And that's one of the reasons we have these discrepancies and why the gentlemen and ladies of the Election Commission have to have enormous flexibility for all these different elections.
Thank you very much, Larry. We've also been joined by my colleague, City Councilor Frank Baker. And Ian, welcome back. If you can state your name and affiliation for the record, and you have the floor.
Councilors, thank you for having me today. Councilor Flaherty, Councilor Campbell, Councilor Wu, Councilor Cheney, who is on our board, Councilor Zachem, Councilor Flynn, and Councilor Baker. Thank you for all having me. This is not only a short-term issue, this is a long-term issue that we need to discuss in full. I think, as you pointed out, Councilor Flaherty, that we need to get something done before the 2020 census, which Dion's plan does, Commissioner Irish's plan goes into depth on a couple of precincts. But I do want everyone to know, and some councilors would probably say the same, is that it's not just these precincts. I live in Ward 3, Precinct 1 in the North End, Christopher Columbus Park. We have 3,050 people as of now. I want to throw some numbers at you of registered voters in the 2018 election. In the 2018 midterm election of registered voters, the Boston average per precinct was 1,620 people. Of the City Hall, Beacon Hill Islands average, which is in Councilor Flynn's district, I believe that is Ward 3, Precinct 6, there was 4,751 people. The Chinatown average is 5,266. The South End average is almost 2,500. And 91 out of 255 of our precincts go over the Boston average. So this is not just this is what we're doing here with sub-precincting is a Band-Aid to a bigger issue. And I hope that after the 2020 census data is pushed out, that we can review that. And just so we note here, this is not just registered voters we're talking about. With reforms like Election Day registration coming, we have to be prepared for people to come and vote on Election Day. So that may not be registered. So the numbers that I'm giving you, there's some flexibility with them. So this is not just something that we need to fix now, but we need to develop a formula for the future down the line that is long-term and not have this not be solved for another 50 years, perhaps. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So we'll get, before we shift to our next docket number, which we were asking folks to stay, I'm going to turn it over to lead sponsor for the second docket, but she has questions on this one as Council President Campbell.
Thank you, Councilor Flaherty. And just so we don't get confused, I'll keep the docket separately. So I'll just talk about the mayor's proposal, and I'm sure others have questions as well. So I'll be short and brief. Just, I guess, picking up sort of on Ian's point, I'm just curious why just these 6 precincts and not others that might have a population that warrants review and possibly dividing or subdividing. Just curious from your perspective, Commissioner, and your team's perspective, why these 6 and not others? And then a follow-up question to that, or second question is, what's the appetite at the State House? Is the goal to try to get this passed and have these changes show up for the next, or the election this year? What's the process and the conversation with the State House folks with respect to this?
Our goal is to hopefully get these changes implemented this year, and there is a good appetite at the State House that we think that would aid with this process. The other question was why these precincts?
And not others that.
And not others.
Yep.
So first criteria is that we wanted to make as few changes as we had to, because change is disruptive. And although we're going to do as much as we can to notify voters, we still prefer to not make changes unless we absolutely have to. The precincts that we identified are precincts that over the last 5-6 years have been a huge issue for the department and for voters. And the numbers back it up. When you look at the numbers in 5-1, it's the largest precinct in the city. I think we said it's over 6,000 voters. 3-8. 5-1 is also not far from that number. In 6-1, you have a huge amount of voters, but you also have a distance issue where voters have raised concern about their rights being violated because of how far they have to actually travel to vote, and we should be making voting convenient. So when we looked at, use those criteria as which precincts are the most problematic, have the most voters, and with an eye towards not changing things that may have a number that we're not comfortable with right now, but we are able to manage it through those elections, we wanted to leave those precincts alone so we could make them a part of a more comprehensive review.
No, it's very helpful, and I think it sort of feeds into the next docket and a sort of need to do a proactive review, but I don't want to confuse the docket, so I'll keep it separate. Thank you. Thank you, Commissioner.
Michelle Wu.
Thank you. Thank you again for being here. And I know we've had several meetings offline too about this, so I appreciate how much time and energy of yours has gone into it. So I was just checking, I know you had mentioned, Commissioner, this was online. I wanted to send it to some people who are interested so they could follow along, but it's actually not posted yet, this current proposal, but the last one is. It's being worked on. Okay, thank you, great. So if, that'd be great, I'll follow up afterwards then. It did remind me that the last one that was posted was the one leading up to when the council passed the home rule and Mayor Walsh signed it in March of 2017, that did not go anywhere at the State House. Do you think there will be, I mean, what leads you to think that it will be a different dynamic this year?
We've been having conversations with our partners at the State House. I think the last time around there were many factors that came into play, but not directly related to this. And also there is there's confusion around this. So we've had to have many conversations just to sort of get on the same page with everyone as to what we're trying to accomplish, because this normally gets lumped into re-precincting and other re-precincting conversations that have been had in the last 20 years with the city. So I think we're at a point now where it's clear that this is a short-term thing that we're trying to accomplish, and Mayor Walsh wants to also have that long-term conversation.
Do you have someone who will file it, who will be the champion up at the State House?
We do. I can't. Chairman Mikowicz.
Okay.
By the way, represents many of the precincts where these issues occurs, so it hits home for him.
You said earlier, and you said in several of our meetings, that the city actually doesn't need to go through a home rule petition to do this, that we have the authority according to the Acts of 1921, except for this small piece about adjusting some of the state databases to match the new precinct, essentially the definitions. But we could do everything. And in fact, the city has changed polling locations and lines before of other precincts.
Yes, but with the changes we're proposing in terms of creating sub-precincts or new precincts, there are limits to the authority that we have. One is we can't affect wards, but as Mr. DeCario mentioned, there's a strong argument for not changing our wards, and we don't need to change our wards to equalize our precincts. The other limiting factor is the timing of what we're trying to accomplish. The time that enables us to use the authority without needing a home rule petition would be after the 2020 census and prior to new districts being created in 2022 and 2023, or being effective in 2022 and 2023. So 2021 is the actual year where we could actually put something forward, and this kind of, it goes into the other docket. But I think what we can do collectively is to begin that process of to envision what could it look like, what changes would we make if we made wholesale changes, and that would allow everyone to provide input, and we could work together, over the next 2 years to come up with something that is comfortable and we have wide agreement on.
So as long as the city wouldn't be touching ward lines and political district lines, your department could, or the Elections Commission could essentially erase everything and redraw from between when the census data comes back and when redistricting needs to happen? Is that
That's
what you're saying?
correct.
Without any state involvement, without a home rule petition?
Without a home rule petition, that's
Okay,
correct.
but that's the only window where that's true?
Yeah, that window is like a parallel track to the re-precincting effort that will be undertaken by the state, by all other communities except Boston, Rockport, and Nantucket. Everyone else, per Mass General Law 54, Chapter 54, will be undergoing the process after receiving the 2020 census data of reviewing their precincts, equalizing them,
And
submitting a
our
new plan.
exemption would just mean that we would not need the Secretary of State to directly oversee it, whereas everyone else would.
That's correct. I mean,
Okay.
but we've had conversations with the Secretary of State, and they'd love to see what our process would look like,
Yeah.
and we'd love to get them
So-
on board with whatever we agree to as well.
Just to understand the window a little better, when does the redistricting data, or when does the census data come back?
That comes back early 2021, and
Like February, March-ish, or,
about around that time.
okay.
And then communities develop new precinct plans and submit it to the local city council or selectmen in June. And then from there, their plans would be submitted to the local election district review committee. And the process of new district making will begin in the latter part of 2021, with those districts becoming effective December 31st in 2021.
Okay, because our former council president said that's, you need it done by a year before
Yes.
by November 21, essentially.
Just because I've been in the room with the computers trying to figure these things out, I believe that some years it's May or June before the precincts are finalized. It's around then. And the House is going to vote that bill by no later than the middle of October of
Yeah.
necessity. So it's a very tight window.
So essentially, we just, okay, if this doesn't pass this year at the State House with the home rule petition, the city could still do this, but just in that April and May window. And if we wait and don't do this until then, it feels like it would be impossible to do anything larger in the April and May window, except for this, right?
Can you repeat that question?
So if, okay, let's say, assuming this passes this year up at the State House and this gets implemented by the 2020 elections, what are you hoping for in terms of redrawing in the April and May window of 2021 that the city has full authority over?
So we're hoping to take a look at all the precincts and to see where else changes need to be made in terms of, are there precincts that need to be, that are too big? Are there some that are too small that may benefit from consolidation?
And is that possible to start then? Is there any way to kind of get a jump on it with, you know, not the latest census data, but whatever the most recent count was to even, it just feels like there's too much community process necessary to fit into April and May to do
Yeah, so
anything big.
that's exactly what I'm trying to say, is that I think we can start that process now in
Okay.
terms of developing drafts using current data to say,
Okay.
these are the changes that we would make if this was 2021.
And that's the
and
next
get
step.
community
Yeah.
feedback, elected official feedback and so forth.
Okay, so for this, though, we're really just hoping for the State House to have more of an eye on it, and you feel confident that there'll be more support this time around. And there's no changes other than, there's no changes compared to the 2017 version.
No, just one minor change in terms of which direction a line went, in, I think in 5-1.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, great, thank you.
Councilor Flynn, any more on this docket? Councilor Flynn?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I had a question for the election department. With these changes possibly taking place, I think Councilor Janey was asking about the notification process for residents of voters that would be impacted. I'm also concerned about residents of voters being impacted. And I represent a large immigrant community. I represent a large community that often does not speak English as well. Would you commit to doing a robust outreach to the residents, explaining what the changes are, and would you be willing to have meetings in the neighborhood discussing what the changes are and communicating with them in their own language?
Absolutely, yes.
So what would the time frame look like if that were the case?
I imagine the time frame would be, I mean, once this, I'm assuming this gets approved soon, it would be June, July, August of this year that we'd have those conversations.
So we would have outreach in August for people, for residents, to inform them that there's a possible change for September?
Yes. And we could work with you on the timing, and we could also commit to doing multiple mailings so that there's notification that goes out at a good time, at least 20 days before each election.
I just think having a community forum in August for a September election, I think it's a quick turnaround. That would be a concern of mine.
So when would you suggest that we have the community meeting?
Well, I want to make sure we give people enough ample notification of what the changes are. I just think doing it in August, we don't want to discourage people from not voting, and we want to give them as much information as we can in a decent time frame. We also have to communicate with them in their language as well. So some of those types of logistic issues would be a concern of mine.
So, we share your concern, and we're willing to do everything that we can to communicate early and clearly and make sure that voters are aware of any change that gets approved. And we've also taken steps to sort of limit the way it would impact them. Although we're talking about creating sub-precincts, from a voter's perspective, in most cases, they're going to the same location that they've been accustomed to going. There'll just be an additional machine and additional staff available at that location to make voting go more smoothly for them.
The precinct at 6-1, if you were to split 6-1 up in terms of physically having a certain segment of the population voting at District Hall and the remaining continuing to vote at the Condon, where would you make that cut at?
Summer Street, I
Street.
think.
Yeah, I believe it's right on.
I think it's Summer Street.
Summer Street.
That's what I think
So,
it said.
so if you live in Fort Point, you'd continue to vote at the Condon?
That's correct.
Well, technically half of Fort Point, so if you're on Melcher Street, you're voting at the Condon, but if you're at Sleeper Street, you're voting at District Hall.
Yeah, right.
So to that, if you look at that map, Ed, it kind of cuts Fort Point right in half.
That'd be Congress Street, wouldn't it?
Yeah, correct. Congress Street may be a better line of demarcation for you guys. We can talk about that. Council Flynn makes a good point there.
So we could work with you. We could make that adjustment.
And if these changes were to take place, what impact would that have down the road as it relates to redistricting? Or is that the next docket we're going to discuss?
Yeah, that is the next docket. But I would still say again that we view this re-precincting citywide, looking at precincts to equalize them, is a conversation that we want to have with you. And with the community, quite frankly. To make decisions like this, we need as much input as possible. So it would be difficult to say that exactly what we would do, because we want to approach this as a collective effort.
And I just, based upon the last 30 or so years, there is a date certain, sometime May, June, no later than that, in 2021, when whoever is drawing the lines on the state level will be given the data and will start working. So we have about 2 years and some change to do whatever we want to do. It's about 2 years. But there's no going back. So if hypothetically this home rule petition doesn't pass and we have to deal with those big precincts, if nothing's done, that's going to make the whole redistricting process more difficult. And I'm glad that Aaron, Chairman Michaelwitz, is going to file this because his district is dramatically impacted. He has a lot of the same precincts that you do, Councilor.
Right.
So that you're trying to come together, put together a district with precincts 3, 1 through 4, the north end, and then some downtown precincts. You may be able to not constitutionally provide for it because those precincts are so big. The small precincts are easy to build, easy building blocks. Big precincts are difficult.
Yeah, go ahead, Commissioner.
I just wanted to add to that. What has happened historically, because we have not on our own addressed precinct sizes, is that the general court, as Mr. Carey pointed out, they actually make changes for us. In 1990, they made changes, and they used voting tabulation district instead of following our precinct lines because the numbers wouldn't work. After the 2010 census, they actually created a sub-precinct for us to make the numbers work, and that's 528.
Yep,
511.
511 the time before.
Okay, yeah.
528.
So the track record has shown that if we don't make changes ourselves, then those changes will be made at the State House because they do have to make the numbers work to create districts that are relatively equal in size.
Now, if this were to take place, the re-precincting, does it set us up for any certain steps we're required to do for redistricting? Meaning, will all precincts be located in the same ward during re-precincting as we do redistricting down the road?
Yeah, it's not necessary that ward lines be changed at all, Counselor. I think that the Commissioner has stated that because the ward lines are very important for ISD assessing all sorts of things, but within the wards, there could be changes made.
Meaning what?
Meaning you could have different precinct lines within the wards.
My big concern is I don't want to see an area that's predominantly immigrant be watered down at all. And I want to see that type of precinct stay intact and make sure that they're represented equally is critical. That's my main.
There are actually constitutional cases there, packing and cracking, so I don't think that anybody on the state level, at least from the people I've worked with over the past 35 years, would try to do that. In fact, efforts are made, extraordinary efforts, to unite communities of interest whenever possible, difficult though it might be. I don't have all the stats in my head, but I believe that the district, which is currently represented by Representative Mickelwich, has a Asian American population north of 20% because 3738 and 51 are all together.
Right.
And that was not completely by accident. That was done to give strength to the Asian community.
Yeah, I think that's important. That's critical as we go forward. That the Asian community in this area is not divided. I want to see that stay intact, and that's something that's going to be a top priority for me.
No, so we agree, and there are actually protections in the law as well that would, I think we'd get sued if we did that, quite frankly. The Civil Rights Act in 1965, Section 2, covers this as well. So that's one of the filters that we would have to abide by to not dilute minority populations, to not heavily rely on race and things of that nature.
The good news is the city's a much more integrated place than it was 50 years ago. That's a good thing, and it's also a bad thing if you're trying to concentrate political power.
Right.
That's a whole other lecture.
And here's another question I have. Sorry to take up all the time, but on an unrelated issue, in my district, I have Emerson College. I also have Suffolk University, and a lot of students in the downtown area. Are they factored already in the census, or are they factored in this this map of registered voters or population, or what impact would the young students in downtown Boston have on this discussion?
So if the sheet you're looking at now is just based on registered voters, but when we look at it from, when we use census data, then we expect that they'd be factored into that data.
So they'll be factored into the data for when? For what period of time?
Well, there's two. Currently, with the city's annual census, they're already factored in, right? But that's 17 and older. in terms of the U.S. Census Bureau data, that is the data that the general court will be using to create new districts after the 2020 census. So we'd also want to look at it from that perspective to see what the resident data in the U.S. Census looks like, as well as what our data looks like.
And in the downtown area, as you know, there's probably at least a dozen skyscrapers that have residences in them, several thousand people. Are they factored in already?
Yes, they are. And that has also contributed to the urgency of trying to do something to address these precincts.
Okay, they're factored in how?
In terms of the number of residents, number of registered voters that we have in those precincts currently, and also what we expect to grow. When new buildings come online, we go out, we survey them, and we add them to our database, so we see what the potential for more registered voters is.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Councilor Zakhem, anything on this one?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just want to thank the Elections Department and the administration for being proactive on this. I think to a point that Councilor Wu made earlier, or really brought forth earlier, is that we are limited in what we can do without home rule, without the state, and obviously the other docket, I think, addresses that more directly and is long overdue and will not be the first time since I've been here even that this body has passed a re-precincting home rule. But it is so important what you all are doing, what your team is doing to make it easier for people to participate. And, to Larry's point about higher turnout, we see that, we saw that. In last year, in our statewide elections, certainly higher than expected, and I think, we're not going to approach presidential levels in our municipal or our state elections, but we're getting closer, and I think it's really important that we're proactive on this, particularly my good colleague, Councilor Flynn's district, many of which those precincts abut precincts that I represent and that are also growing rapidly. I just want to be as supportive as we can to make this process easier. And the fact that you all are doing this with this body's support, with the mayor's support, is critical to democracy in the city of Boston. So thank you for that. And obviously, to our colleagues, I'm not going to be able to stay for the second docket discussion, but I do want to say this is vitally important. I do look forward to supporting that again and hopefully getting some action to finally bring Boston more in line with where we should be, where the rest of the state is when it comes to precincting generally. So no questions, just comments. Thank you.
Thank you. Councilor Janey, anything to add on this?
Just briefly, so thank you, Mr. Chair. I want to thank the panel. I want to thank you all for the work that you're doing. And something that you said, Commissioner, really stands out for me, which is that if we don't do something, something will be decided for us. And so I think very important that we be proactive in tackling these issues for all the reasons that we've discussed today, but also looking to the future, which Mr. DeCara and Ian so eloquently spoke to. I want to come back to specifically, and I apologize to my colleagues. So I want to thank the panel. I want to thank the administration for being proactive. I want to thank you for your leadership and Councilor Zakhem for his leadership on these issues. Very important. I want to come back to the notification piece. When you put forth that Mandela will be the voting location for, is it 93A?
Correct.
Just so that we're clear. How did you come to that decision, and who was involved in that decision? So were any of the neighborhood groups over at Mandela or in the surrounding area part of that discussion, or no?
Well, I'll say, first let me say that none of those decisions are set in stone. Like, we're still open to another polling place in that area if there's a better one available. What we wanted to do is to not come to this hearing without any information at all, or any potential other sites. So we did explore other sites, and we did talk to organizations that we currently work with that are in other parts of the city. And when we approached them, they said, yeah, absolutely, you could have voting there if you guys would choose to. With District Hall, it was more of a survey. We had to figure out where would folks vote in this part, in the South Boston waterfront, if we were able to create the sub-precinct. And we explored that location, we reached out to them, And they said, yeah, absolutely, we'd love to be a polling place if this happens.
Wonderful, and so
But
for...
we're not committed until we're still open to public.
I understand, and I appreciate that this is still the planning stage, the thinking stage, and that changes can be made if need be. In terms of Mandela, has there been a conversation with the folks over at Mandela in terms of opening up their doors? Or are they watching it on television
management company,
and
yes.
finding out?
No, we've spoken to the management company.
Wonderful.
Yes.
Thank you. That's helpful. So again, I'm very concerned about making sure that we get the information out. I have experienced as a voting rights activist the challenges that residents face when polling locations change, and somehow, despite the best efforts of the city or our nonprofit partners or others who are in this space, somehow, certain residents are still not getting the word. So I think, making sure that we have a good plan and that we're executing that plan is very important, and I'm happy to partner with you around how we ensure that residents in the area are aware that this change, one, that there's a proposal on the table. So I'd love, if this is in fact going to be more convenient, I'd love to hear residents co-sign and say, yes, this is a good move because it'll be more convenient. Two, making sure that those other residents who may not come out for a meeting are getting the word. So I think anything and everything we can do is really important. What I don't want to see happen is come Election Day, folks are being turned away from their place that has been their place for the longest time to then have to go somewhere else. What is unique and I think great about Mandela is that for residents who need to travel there, I mean, usually we try to make sure that polling locations are walkable from someone's home, but if people are coming on public transit, there is a bus stop there on the Silver Line. They do have parking in the back for people who want to drive on their way to work or wherever they may be going afterwards. So just making sure we have the right signage. It seems like a good location based on those things, but I think really I want to make sure that residents are okay with this and that they are informed about the change and have the opportunity to, show up at the right place on Election Day and are not being turned away. Because the whole point, as someone has pointed out, and as I've said in hearings like this, voting should be easy, and it can be easy if we're doing the right things in terms of city government. So I think that is it for me. I'd love to just follow up with you offline to make sure that there is a good plan in place for notifying those residents. The number here will be split. So for 9-3A, how many folks are we talking about that would have to be informed of the location change?
1,650.
1,600 and what?
50.
50, wonderful. So making sure, and then how many households is that?
Don't know.
But fewer. So making sure that those 1,650 residents are getting that information. Happy to work in partnership and to do anything that I can do on my end to make sure that folks know about the change. So thank you, and I will have to slip out, but I want to show appreciation for my colleagues here for their leadership.
Thank you, Councilor Janey.
Thank you.
This is our time for public testimony. I see Eric Estevez. He's asked to offer public testimony on this docket 0211. Larry, you're going to escape. You're excused. All right. Very good. Good to see you. Ian, if you want to stick around for the next docket, you're welcome to do that. Good. Thank you.
Good afternoon. My name is Eric Estevez. I'm a resident of Roxbury. Not too long ago, I was a member of a co-ed, cross-neighborhood, multi-ethnic, multilingual group of residents and activists who push for a heightened sense of both equity and urgency in how the city handles both redistricting and reprecincting. This was back in 2011 and 2012. That group, loosely referred to as the Community of Color Redistricting Coalition, embarked upon a public awareness campaign to educate everyday residents about the importance and significance of the census and how an accurate count then translates into specific funding streams for cities and towns that ought to be fair and balanced. In many parts of the country, as you know, voter disenfranchisement is a real thing that impacts voter turnout and election results. In fact, the closure of voting locations and subsequent longer lines is one direct impact of such policy change. In Boston, we have inherited the unintended consequences of non-proactive planning. I support the effort to create additional sub-precincts to alleviate voter congestion. However, the need for sub-precincts would be a moot point if the council had heeded an earlier recommendation of the coalition to embark upon re-precincting with haste prior to the deadlines and prior to the state's redistricting process. And as you know, back in, I think, 1990, that changed. The state used to do their process 5 years after the census. They didn't move that up due to some changes in law and court decisions. Thus, I strongly urge the council to make sure it follows through on its stated goals of reviewing and actually following through on re-precincting the city by 2021. For context, the coalition organized a research team dedicated to crunching demographic figures, assessing acceptable voter population variances, drawing dozens of different maps, analyzing CVAP, citizen voting age population numbers, and also gauging the legal and policy ramifications of each map. I'd like to remind the council that the coalition did in fact seek legal counsel and initiated an exploration of litigation to ensure that the final maps in terms of the redistricting process ensured full representation. A key limiting factor in doing the redistricting process was a failure of the city to keep current with evolving population trends and varying geographic density, as Commissioner Irish has referenced today as well. It's no secret that some wards and precincts present significant hurdles when it comes to the process of trying to keep the city council district as continuous and contiguous as possible by respecting neighborhood boundaries as best as possible and working hard not to crack or pack, as Mr. DeCara mentioned, which is in essence the disenfranchisement via dilution or oversaturation of specific populations with voting rights protections. So lastly, I'd just like to say I support the comments of Councilor Janey and Flynn to ensure the city provides comprehensive communication to residents impacted by the change. I do think personally, and I think many others agree, that the city does need to re-precinct, so there will be populations impacted doubly by a change in their sub-precincts and then a likely possible change in the full city re-precincting process. But I think it's towards an effort of actually offering fuller representation for the whole city. Thank you.
Good. Thank you, Eric. Good to see you. All right, so that will conclude. Is anyone else looking to offer public testimony on docket 0211? Seeing and hearing no desire, that will close docket 0211. Chair recognizes Ian. Go ahead.
I wanted to add something about the home rule process. As a former State House staffer myself, and also constituent of Rep. Mikowitz, he's filed this before many a times, as we know. We know that home rule petitions do get lost in the mud a lot. The Election Laws Committee is meeting for the first time on the 10th, and the majority of what they're hearing is already filed legislation concerning home rule petitions. So I do want to urge the concern that home rule petitions do get lost, and they do not get the attention that they should sometimes.
Very good. Fair point. And that will conclude docket 0211. We're going to shift now to docket 0314 and allow the lead sponsors to open up. Councilor Campbell, followed by Councilor Wu, to give opening comments, and then get the administration's perspective, hear from Mass Vote, see if there's any public testimony, and we'll go from there.
Thank you, Councilor Flaherty.
We've also been joined by our colleague, City Council Lady Edwards.
And thank you to Councilor Wu for not only her partnership on this, and our goal was to do an ordinance so that we could actually get it done quickly versus a home rule petition, but also for her past leadership with respect to the re-precincting conversations even before I joined the council. So I want to thank her for the partnership on this in particular, but also for her past leadership. And we know that the city of Boston is exempt, unlike other municipalities in the Commonwealth, when it comes to re-precincting. And so when we were having these conversations offline with advocates, as well as, of course, you, Commissioner, and the administration, and thank you guys for the work that you guys do every single day, it did come up that we need to think about how do we pass something that mandates that the city of Boston, even after we're all gone, continues to actually take a proactive stance in reviewing precincts, so that when we get into that window of time where we as a city have the authority to make changes to our precincts, we have a plan that's been reviewed not only by the commissioner and your team, but also by the council. I think we got to some conversation earlier, and Eric just sort of testified on the importance of having a plan, community engagement, making sure that we have adequate time to get out into community, whether in hearings or formal or informal community meetings, so that they can inform how we redraw these lines, the polling locations we choose. This ordinance is a way to mandate that the city of Boston actually does that review, and that we do it either every 3 years, every 5 years. I mean, in the ordinance, it sets out every 5 years, but there's been some conversation that maybe it should be every 3 years. We can have, hence why we want to hear your thoughts. But that we not only mandate that the city of Boston do it, but that we do it in partnership. I think one technical edit that I will put on the record that I think is worth making is, you know, this says the appropriate committee of the city council. We'd like to add actually the commissioner, the elections commissioner, so that it's done in partnership, that it's not just obviously the council itself, but it truly is a partnership between the council as well as the elections commissioner and department. So I think where we say the committee or where we say the appropriate committee, we add language that adds the elections commissioner as well, so that it's not just the council doing the review. And the goal is that once we get that information, we can then have a robust conversation, not only in community, but also hopefully make some of these changes without having to go through the home rule process, without giving up the flexibility and the authority that the city of Boston currently has. You know, obviously it will maintain the exemption that currently exists with the state, but allow us to maintain a sense of flexibility around timing and our authority to do this. So looking forward to the conversation. And again, thank you, Councilor Flaherty, for scheduling this so quickly. Thank you, Councilor Wu. And I also want to thank Christine, who is our counsel for the central staff. When we were going back and forth on whether or not we could do this, she put in a lot of work with respect to whether or not an ordinance can actually happen, and did a lot of back and forth. So I also want to thank Christine for her work as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Council President Campbell. Chair recognizes Councilor Michelle Wu, also the co-sponsor.
This is great, and we covered a lot already, so I just wanted to thank everyone for their work, to President Campbell and Councilor Flaherty for making sure we got a hearing on this, and also just to again emphasize how much there is to do in such a small window, in that probably 2-month period, 2 years from now. So we'll get into this in questions, but I think even more important than this actual language is my desire to try to understand what the process will look like and what the planning is looking like in terms of actually getting to a place where we're doing at least some major re-precincting leading into that 2021 window. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilor Wu. So thoughts from the administration and/or mass vote on this proposal by my colleagues?
I think this is a great proposal. And you amended it to write the election commission in, but quite frankly, we, after reviewing this, we already planned that not only would the election department be a part of this, but spoken to the our IT department, our GIS folks, they're ready to help with this, and same goes for the Boston Planning and Development Agency, because this will be, as I said before, a very collective effort. I think this council with this ordinance helps us to make sure that there's the proper engagement that's necessary and that it's completely transparent, because we know that this changes need to be made, but we don't want to do it alone. We want to make sure that, you know, we're doing it with, in plain view, with, you know, in the daylight, and everyone gets a chance to give us feedback and input. And I think that we should not look at this as a 2-month window in 2021. We should look at it as a 2-year window where we can begin to start having conversations now and putting things out to have a 2-year comment period.
Great. Thank you. Those are helpful suggestions as well. Sabino, anything additional to that? Gotcha.
I echo what Dion said.
Thank you. And Ian, any thoughts from sort of the mass vote? House?
Yes, so this is very common sense, obviously, but, you know, I also do want to talk about the future of precincts. You know, there's a lot of states, and this is more at the state level, but city council does influence state legislation. Your name has backing behind it. I did want to talk about and mention that there's a lot of states like Colorado and Washington that are moving away from even having precincts and just doing mail balloting altogether, which is odd, but you talk
Where is
about...
that, Ian?
Huh?
Where is that?
Colorado, for example. There's some cost reductions. Obviously, we talked about cutting precincts, and this is more way down the line, but it's something that we do need to keep in the eye, keep in consideration. And, there are bills filed currently in the House for an opt-in system for mail balloting. It would help a lot of people with disability, things like that, but it would inadvertently help with the precinct process cutting down and all that.
Interesting.
So-
So, say, for example, in Colorado, is there a district councilor versus an at-large councilor? How would they sort of differentiate between sort of the district boundary lines and sort of the whole city?
You're talking with precincts and
Yeah.
how they do. I'm not very familiar with how their
Okay.
actual precincts work. I know just from a voter standpoint that people will, they have drop centers. They have, places in the park where you just drop your ballot, in something just like a postal box. So there are those reforms coming about, and I think the council should pledge some support to those and, think about long-term ways that we can not only encourage voters to more easily vote, but also to reduce the cost with the precinct and make less work for ourselves at the precinct
It's interesting.
level.
Thank you, Ian. Council Flynn, anything 0314?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just going for my notes on this docket, I asked some of the similar questions in the previous docket, but can you talk about what impact this will have on future redistricting in the time frame as well?
We think that embarking on a process to equalize our precincts will aid district making. It would give the council and it would give the State House better building blocks to use to create districts. And it would also allow us to be proactive to agree on the changes that we want to make ourselves, as opposed to not making any changes and having changes being forced upon us by the state because of the fact that they need to make the math work. And when the window of time becomes even shorter than 2 months, and they're creating districts, they'll just pass legislation to make changes to our precincts in order to build districts.
Would a precinct during redistricting down the road, would there ever be a scenario where a precinct would be broken up, or would a precinct always stay together?
A precinct would always stay together because that's the smallest building block. Now, a precinct, whether or not that precinct is going to be in the same district is really a part of the redistricting process, where at the council level, like, there would be a decision made as to what precincts from what wards are going to be a part of District 2, for example. That's totally beyond the process that the election department gets involved with. We just try to give you good tools, so to speak, so that you could create districts.
But there could be a scenario where a precinct in one district would be moved into another district down the road.
That's possible, but that's not something that the election department has the ability to do.
Do you know, just thinking outside the box, does Boston have enough population for another district? Another city council district?
Yeah, I think that would be up to the city council and the city. That'd be an amendment to the city charter. What would happen is whatever number of precincts is decided upon for the city, then the population will be divided. I mean, you'd build districts to keep those precincts equal, I think, within 10%, I think it is, for districts.
Or would each district just gather certain precincts if one wasn't, if one district wasn't added? Would each current district take on more population?
That's probably the way it will go.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Is there a set number of people in a district for minimum and maximum?
I think the number is set based on the criteria of having them relatively equal within 10%.
What would that number be?
Whatever the total number of population is.
Yeah, it'd be the total number of population divided by what, nine districts?
So do we have a rough estimate of what the average population is for each district, or for each, or for the registered number of voters? How are we factoring that? I think, like, for example, my district, I have, you know, a dozen skyscrapers that are added to the downtown area. They may or may not be registered voters, but in terms of constituent services, you're providing quality constituent services to the resident regardless of whether they're registered or not. But what impact would these skyscrapers have if they each have 2,000 people in them, and it's an additional population of 20,000? How would that be factored in?
Yeah, so the districts are going to be based on population. So my guess is, and we can probably all agree that since the district was created in 2013, it's grown tremendously. And if you were to use the criteria of equal to other districts within 10%, you're probably beyond that. But that happens over time, and hence the necessity to have a review every 10 years and to go through this process all over again. But yes, if your district is now, you know, has way more voters, way more residents, sorry, than other districts, then in 2023, the council will collectively decide to go through that process to equalize those districts for the next 10 years.
And I also represent a large number of residents in public housing. What type of outreach are we doing to residents in public housing, and what type of demographics have we learned about where the population is in public housing?
Well, we don't collect demographic information, but the outreach that we do, particularly around the annual census, is, you know, we're working directly with the Housing Authority to make sure that we get the resident information incorporated into our annual city census.
Is that just residents on the lease in terms of public housing? Is that how you would factor that in?
We asked the Housing Authority to supply us a list of all residents age 17 and older. And you are correct. I believe they only supply what's on the lease.
Okay. That's a big concern of mine as well. As I mentioned, I represent a large number of public housing residents. I want to make sure that they're factored in, they're counted, and that we do, at the right time, we do a thorough job of making sure every person, we're doing the census now, but every person in public housing is counted. So you'll have an aggressive communication outreach with BHA on that?
Yes, well, as it relates to the U.S. Census, you know, as you know, we already have launched the city's census efforts, and the goal is to make sure that we get everyone counted in 2020, and it's also important because that is the data that we'll be relying on in 2021 to develop a final proposal.
Okay, then my final question. I know in public housing it can be difficult at times when you're getting letter or getting a piece of mail delivered to you. Do we also have a backup system where we can be 100% guaranteed that the people that need to complete the census information are filling it out and that they get the letter from the city or they're getting the official verification from the election department of any changes. I just want to make sure people in public housing do have the same access to information as anyone else. As I said, it can be difficult at times getting a piece of mail, but could we do a piece of mail and then additional outreach into public housing?
Yeah, what we do for the public housing is all residents do get a mailing by household, and we also get a list supplied to us by the Housing Authority so that it keeps our data up to date.
Okay. And is there what is the role of the city council in terms of helping the election department out with making sure our residents are informed of election changes? Does the district city council work with the election department to help schedule a meeting or help with the outreach to make sure that our residents know about changes? Because I'd love to be part of the conversation. If there were changes in my district, I'd love to be involved in educating my constituents of any changes to various location polls as well.
If I may interject too, I would ask that be a requirement, particularly for the district colleagues of ours in the at-large. And anytime you're going out, I know Councilor Janey had referenced talking about the Mandela stuff, but anytime you guys are going out to a community, I would assume that you would connect and reach out to the district city council, or at the very least in the at-large, to say, hey, we have a thing scheduled next Tuesday or next Wednesday, please join us, or do you know anyone that should come, or should we contact? I think that if it's not part of your routine now, I think it should be pro forma,
Can you repeat the last part?
So it's basically like right now, like any type of outreach to Councilor Flynn's point, any election department outreach to the community should involve at the very least the district city councilor and also a CC to the 4 at-large councilors. But they could also introduce you to folks that they have relationships with, and community leaders and civic leaders that could help broaden sort of the entree, if you will, to getting that information out there, and whether it's a multilingual situation or if it's just, being an echo for the election department. So the way that you guys do it now, I assume that you have your own relationships and you notice folks and you get out to the community. I would ask that if the council is not included, that you add that additional step of including the district and the at-large councilors in that outreach as we start talking about the changing the maps, the re-precinct, and changing locations. It should almost be part of the pro forma, if you will.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, we haven't had many community meetings around things like this, but I think we do a pretty good job of communicating with the council, sending you notifications on any changes that, actually, before we even vote on them, we'll make it a point to send proposals up to the council so that you could weigh in before it's brought to the board to be finalized. And that goes for early voting or polling place changes. And for community meetings, yeah, we would love to have the council support. I think you know your districts and you know the city in ways that we may not know, and so we'd love the benefit of your assistance.
Perfect. Thanks, Commissioner.
Yeah, thank you, Commissioner. And, my final comment is relating to that is, myself and Councilor Edwards is here, but we both represent a large Spanish-speaking community as well, so we would want to make sure that we have, translators that are present at at all these meetings, really. So that's another reason I'd love to be involved and informed and help on that type of outreach as well. Thank you, Commissioner.
Thank you.
Thank you, Councilor. Chair recognizes City Councilor Lydia Edwards.
Much, and thank you for your efforts. I just have more clarification questions, just to make sure I'm understanding the goal of this, which seems to be something that's laudable. I just want to make sure I'm understanding that, though. If I read the mayor's letter correctly, it's really just assuring that on the voting day, we're creating sub-precincts to allow for shorter lines. Am I correct?
Correct. Shorter lines, additional machines, additional resources to enable us to better manage the number of voters at certain locations.
So, and this is, so I don't disagree with that. I'm just why wouldn't we just have two people sitting next to each other for Ward 1, Precinct 4, and then that line, and then Ward 1, Precinct 4 next door to that person, so that there's two people collecting those votes?
You can only have one voting machine per precinct.
Okay. But in
So if
terms
you
of
have a
moving,
precinct with 6,000 potential voters, they'd all have to use the same machine, and it would be a nightmare.
so it wouldn't make a difference then how many people you lined up at the desks, I guess, because at the end of the day, they all have to still be funneled down to the same machine.
Exactly.
Okay, that was a
There are some parts
clarification.
of the city where we do have a pretty significant number of voters in the precinct, but we're able to split the books and have additional staff and do what you suggest, where we have multiple people to aid with the check-in process. But ultimately, those voters are still going to go to the same
They
machine.
stand in a second line then to go to the same, second machine. So, and you have mentioned that there's no difference, or not no difference, but that when I read this documents, the actual precinct, so again, I'm going to go to Ward 1, that's what I think of, right, East Boston. So I'm in Ward 1, Precinct 4. And so this would create a Precinct 4A, Precinct 4B, or whatever sub-district you want. But ultimately, when it comes down to looking at like this, a chart like this, Ward 1, Precinct 4, I'm going to see a total number here. I'm not going to see A and B broken down on the total votes here.
That's incorrect. You're going to see the A and B separated.
I will on this?
Yes, once
Oh.
we do a new proposal to split them, they are technically classified as a separate precinct because
Okay.
it has a separate machine, a separate total, a separate everything.
So then why not just give it a separate number? What's the A and B?
Because we can't create precincts that can only be created during the redistricting process,
Okay, so,
the re-precincting process, excuse me.
which is 2023.
Correct.
So if I am just following up on Councilor Flynn's questions, then it seems like we're preparing then to create these different precincts for 2023, but by calling them A and B right now under the same precinct. I'm okay with that. I'm just making sure I'm clear on what the function of this is. Is that true?
That's true. We're just creating a sub-precinct for it. It's going to clog up our little chart a little
Right.
bit.
Yeah,
but
that's okay.
It's for the purpose of, like Dion had said, to alleviate the lines at a lot of these precincts to make the flow go a lot smoother.
So, and again, this is clarification, so I appreciate the education. Again, I support this, but I want to be clear, when you create these sub-precincts or any kind of, I guess, manipulation of how data is listed, is there any concern, or maybe I'm being too paranoid about concentrating votes or individuals in precincts that are too, so I'm concerned about concentrating or having a precinct that's almost overwhelmingly of one type of person, or very, very poor, very, very rich. And I don't know, I'm concerned about how, when you cut lines and stuff like that, is there any concern of equity impact? I mean, maybe there isn't. At the end of the day, the votes come in, the votes come in. I can say from a campaign purposes, you look at precincts, you look at how they vote, right? And if sub-precincts are broken up in a way that you've concentrated a lot of folks who don't normally vote in one precinct, guess what precinct gets the least amount of attention from candidates and campaigns oftentimes? Not mine, but other people. So, was there any thought about that?
Well, for the changes that we're proposing, there isn't a lot of, there aren't a lot of changes that voters are going to experience in terms of not
Okay.
going to, in many cases, they're going to be going to the same polling place, but there'll be an additional machine and additional staff.
Yes,
In two cases, there would be a different polling place. In 6-1, the 6-1A section would have its own polling place. And when you look at it geographically, there is a huge distance issue. And voters have raised concern that they think that it's unconstitutional, the fact that they have to travel as far as they do to vote.
So that's so that's great that you guys, but you're on it, is what I understand, and you're looking at it and analyzing that. But just, again, we're talking about like the same ward and same precinct, but let's just say by virtue of where you draw the lines, you could be drawing a line that already kind of exists through the way segregation patterns are, that there's a housing development, right? So if you can look at precinct 2-2, I think it is, that's Charlestown, that involves the Navy Yard and the largest development, you know, in New England, a chunk of that. So if you were to create, and you're not proposing, I want to put that on the record, they're not proposing, I'm just for my own, you know, if you were to create a line in that 2-2 and cut between the Navy Yard and the development, unfortunately right now, still there's very low turnout in often cases from the development versus, say, the Navy Yard, which is a little bit more affluent, folks, a little bit more seniors, they tend to vote more. And my concern is that you created, there's already was a barrier, you know, due to other issues, but there's now in our precinct, the way we broke down who and what votes, and I'm concerned, or alleviate my concerns by saying that doesn't make a difference by drawing that line there.
Well, these sub-precincts is not changing who you're voting for. They all still voting for the same representatives, whether it's city council, state rep, or state senator. All we're doing is creating a sub-precinct to alleviate the lines, an additional machine, but in reality, it's the same ballot for that whole precinct. Does that help?
Yeah, it does help. I mean, again, this is something I don't oppose. I'm really trying to get educated. So my concern is that, however, if you have a precinct that doesn't perform, suddenly, like United Precinct 2 looks really, really strong on paper. You know what I'm trying to say? Like United Precinct 2 looks really, really strong because we have a lot of seniors, because we have a lot of, you know, folks with money and things like that. But when you separate it into 2A and B, and all your poverty, people of color and so on and so forth, and Precinct A and the 2B is the other part, then all of a sudden Precinct 2A doesn't look like such a strong voter turnout place, right? And you know, maybe that's something you can't do anything about, but I'm thinking in terms of campaigns, in terms of outreach, in terms of mobilization. Campaigns move to where the vote will come out, where it's worth your time to knock on doors, make those phone calls. And did you look at, am I making sense?
You're making sense, and that is our concern for the larger citywide review, and that's why that's something that we wanted to be completely transparent, and we want to get input, as much input as possible on that to make sure we're not unintentionally doing anything that could disproportionately affect anyone. So that's, I think, a concern that we all have to approach the larger comprehensive equalization process with. As it relates, separated from the current proposal for sub-precincts, the precincts that we're proposing doesn't do any of that.
Yeah, I noticed that in your maps, that you don't have the same kind of, so.
I just want to take that off the table.
I appreciate that. I did see that.
I agree with what you're saying going forward. As we look at the city, if we're looking to make changes throughout, then we have to look at all of these different layers to make sure that we don't miss an angle and do something. And there is criteria that's already established in the state re-precincting guidelines that I would say that we should follow. Not every single criteria, because I think we should leave our wards alone, and we should think long and hard about the criteria of having no more than 4,000 residents of any age in a precinct. As Mr. DeCaro mentioned earlier, it would not work well for Boston, but we can come up with objective criteria that we can all, get agreement on. And then we have to look at the city demographically to say, well, if we made these changes based on what would be good boundaries according to the state guidelines and what are good numbers, did it have an unintended impact on, on minority populations and
or poor people,
communities of interest? So I think it'll be a process where we could begin, I would say this summer, to come up with something that folks could react to. That's not set in stone, that we could, as we get new data, update over time towards having something ready for 2021 for when the final data comes out.
So, because I'm also thinking, Ward 14, East Boston, right? You have a concentration with the Orion Heights development versus the other part of Orion Heights. So I think this kind of concentration, you might find that kind of I would encourage that perspective to be thinking about every time throughout Boston where we have large housing developments in precincts that might be cut off or different and be demographically different than, say, the rest of the population around them, which you can find in a lot of places. So thank you so much. I know you just showed you're on the ball and you're looking at it, and I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. At this time, is there anyone wishing to offer public testimony on this docket, docket 0314? May do so now or forever hold your peace. Come down and offer public testimony. That will conclude the public testimony portion. I know that Councilor Wu has some final questions, and then she'll bring it out as the lead co-sponsor. Chair recognizes Councilor Michelle Wu.
Thank you. Apologies for more clarifications. So just a quick bit of curiosity. When the Elections Department changed the precinct boundary line between, remember, Smith House and Haynes House, that was just the commission and not even the council and not the State House? Is that correct?
Correct.
Okay. And so how was that what authority was the commission able to use to change that precinct boundary, but that we wouldn't be able to do a split without the State House?
That utilize the authority that the Board of Election Commissioners have to make adjustments to precincts. We did not create a sub-precinct.
Right.
What we did was we made a line adjustment.
Okay.
And that actually captured one building of seniors based on the fact that moving that line had no impact on any district on any level.
Yeah.
It did not impact a ward. And
Are there
it did not create.
other similar type changes that, besides shifting lines, that fall into this category of not being sort of major enough to trigger the home rule, which includes a bucket of splitting precincts? Is there anything else that the commission could do today in addition to shifting boundary lines of precincts?
I'm sure that there are. The question is there a need? Like, what would create the need to do so? So if there were an issue that we were trying to solve and we could solve it without going through that process, then we would. That change that we made, that was a result of a community actually reaching out to us, bringing something to our to our attention that actually made a lot of sense, that you had two senior buildings that were right across the street from each other, but the folks in one building couldn't vote in the polling place across the street. They had to go about 2 miles away up a hill.
Okay, great. Okay, interesting. But there is some category of things that the city can do.
Yeah.
So just to the final sort of fine point on if this ordinance passes and the committee of the city council will conduct a review, which I assume will be the committee that I chair on census and redistricting, what is the ideal process from your perspective of how that review happens with the council committee? What, in terms of timeline? I mean, the ordinance says that the review shall begin in the year immediately following passage. So when would you want to do internal work versus taking something out for community feedback?
Yeah, so I mean, we're open to, I think this is new for all of us.
Okay.
So to developing that process and figuring out what it should look like. We talked about criteria. I think we should utilize as much of the criteria that already exists in the state re-precincting laws.
Okay.
And apply that to us and make adjustments as we feel are necessary for Boston. I think we should create some drafts of what precinct changes could look like and have an elongated, iterative process of getting feedback from the community. And I'm open to what that looks like. That could be community meetings around the city, could be asking folks to take a look. Maybe we have multiple channels. The website is certainly a channel available to folks to take a look and give feedback, but we'd also love to work with the council to go around the city and get feedback as to what, if we were to go with this change, what would that mean? How would that impact you?
Great. Okay, so when this passes, I think it's looking good. We'll follow up separately and begin to map out that process.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Councilor Wu. So I want to take this opportunity to thank Commissioner Irish for your time and attention today, and also Register Piemonte and Ian and the folks at MassVote for participating. seeing a lot of each other lately on these types of issues, but it's important that we continue to put our best foot forward as a city, and so we'll continue to work with you folks. I know we had two important dockets, docket 0211 and docket 0314. My intention is to put together a committee report and have it before the council, probably within the next week or two. So with that, docket 0211 and 0314, the Committee on Government Operations is adjourned. Thank you.